Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon your time zone. My name is Seth Earley, and welcome to our webinar. This is session 5 of our 7-part series. Today, we're going to be talking about data and content foundations, looking at the enterprise ecosystem for RAG performance, retrieval augmented generation, for AI retrieval. And we're going to talk about when out of the box actually works and when you need to really think about IA. And it's not something we've talked about before, really. We've been talking about information architecture and the need for that. There's no AI without IA, etc. But there are certain situations where you don't necessarily need information architecture on your content or you need a light touch, but we'll talk about those situations, and they're very unique situations. I'm here with Heather Eisenbraun, our Chief AI Knowledge Architect, and she's going to be handling a number of pieces, especially talking about our framework for evaluating content for AI retrieval. It's called our AIRR10, AI Retrieval Readiness Model with 10 dimensions. And we have a special offer for attendees at the end of this session. So stay on for that, because we're going to offer you the ability to have your content evaluated, have a unlimited number, up to 3 documents, up to 50 pages each, that we can evaluate, give you the AIRR score, show you what the remediation looks like, and that will be very powerful for beginning to assess your content. We are recording. We're going to go for 50 minutes or so, and we hope to have about 10 minutes for questions and answers and so on. Please use the QA panel to submit your questions throughout the session. We'll try to address in the context of what we're talking about, but we'll try to get to them at the end. And I want to thank our sponsors, Vector, VKTR, great content on that website, and CMS Wire, which has been known around the industry for many years. The Earley Information Science is a professional services firm. We do have software accelerators, and that's one of the things we're talking about today with the AIRR. It's not a sales pitch, but we just want to let you know we are leveraging our capabilities that we've built and honed over the last 30 years, methodologies, templates, frameworks, IP, articles, research, customer projects, all the different deliverables, all the different IP, and we've leveraged that with large language models so that we can build deliverables and we can do information architecture work much more quickly at an improvement of 10x over the old ways of doing these things. In fact, we recently did a project for a professional services firm where we built an ontology and did it in 8 weeks, what would have taken 18 months in the past, 12 to 18 months. So we're really seeing tremendous effectiveness. And this is that's what's changing the landscape of professional services, is how to leverage large language models and AI in the delivery of services so that you can be able to be most efficient and cost effective. And it allows us to do things we couldn't do in the past, right? They were just too expensive. So there's a lot of other pieces to this that are really very beneficial for organizations. As I said, this is session 5. We have 2 more sessions after this. So today we're really going to talk about content readiness, content lifecycle, and doing it across the ecosystem, not just looking at a couple of documents, but saying, how do we do this when we have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of documents? And then next time, we're going to be talking about really doing this from pilot to production and looking at readiness across the organization and building a roadmap that remediates your gaps in readiness. And that is something you should definitely look at, the AI readiness diagnostic quick check that we have been talking about. We have something at the end of this session as well. And then the last session is going to be really building this AI readiness architecture pilot, right? How do we build this? How do we actually execute? How do we structure it? How do we measure it? We'll talk about some of our accelerators and so on. So again, we talked last time about how to build that semantic layer between content and using models that help us apply the information architecture to the content, right? How do we engineer those processes? How do we build that semantic layer? How do we model and structure that information? That's the knowledge engineering piece, right? Going from content to knowledge and what it requires. And today we're going to say, how do we look at this entire content environment? How do we make sure it stays accurate, governance, that it's current across all the different assets that you have? Let's see, we have a question already. Well, yes, you can view the prior session recordings. Absolutely. Those are on the website. There is a link to the 7 sessions. So the ones that have been recorded, you absolutely can access those. Yes. So 2 questions on that. I'll kill 2 question birds with my one answer stone. So again, thinking about this of engineering a document, that's a task. Managing an environment is a discipline. Managing that whole ecosystem is a discipline. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about how when we have out-of-the-box AI and it succeeds, it can be misleading because it gets generalized and applied to other places. So the HR demo trap, right? Many times you use HR content or some other kind of content that is well curated and structured in and of itself because it has to be. And then we say, oh, see, this works. And then we try to apply that and generalize it. And it's really a diagnostic, not a substitute. So we'll talk about that. What are the failure conditions? What are the things that are causing us to have problems with retrieval? And it's sprawl of content, it's format, it's structure, it's version, all of those things that we see every time we do an audit. And a lot of them are not visible to humans browsing the same content. So that's why you need tools and frameworks for that. The measurement framework, how do we score that content for retrieval to say, is it ready? Where does it live on the continuum of readiness? What are the weak areas? What are the patterns that we need to remediate, right? And then this is a weighted metric. So there's a weighted metric. So there are different scoring pieces that will have different weights. And that also varies according to content type. So we'll talk about that as well. And so we're looking for patterns, right? We're looking for recurring patterns, not a document at a time. We're looking at this across the corpus, and we want to engineer in the last stage. And I like this: engineer last, engineer least, right? We want to make sure the punishment fits the crime. We want to make sure we do this in an efficient way. We want to be able to target the content that is exhibiting certain patterns, certain failure patterns that we can remediate, and can remediate that using a human in the loop, but an automated, highly automated process where we don't have to go in and touch all these documents. We can do this from a programmatic way. And then we also want to make sure that we are triaging. We look at this by value, right? We look at the assets and we look at business value. We look at how critical it is to a process, how clear the process is that we're supporting. And then we need to decide whether we keep that content, whether we retire it, whether we fence it off or quarantine it or put it in another place. And then we keep the part of that we actually have to engineer smaller, right? We want to reduce that amount of content that's going to require that engineering. And we also want to manage and monitor drift and think of audits as a loop, right? They continually are executed because the content drift and the model drift do happen over time. They degrade continuously. The audit loop keeps the readiness from decaying. And I have an interesting story about the model drift. So here's what people are saying, right? We're hearing this a lot. Hey, I dropped my 400 PDFs into SharePoint. I asked Copilot about our PTO policy and it answered perfectly. Why do I need anything else, right? And that is a reasonable argument under certain circumstances, right? We say that it's accurate, it's an instant answer, it's grounded, it has a reference. That's all wonderful. Why is that the case? When does it work, right? These products can produce a good output on a certain class of content, right? Because what we're doing is we're storing things at a vectorization level, at a vectorization layer. The storage layer is vectorized. In other words, it's getting cheaper and faster to do that. And that makes it easier for us to retrieve this. But this isn't necessarily a bad pattern, and don't let people tell you it's a bad pattern. It can work. The question is, what content does it work for? What content does it not work for? And the value depends on the quality of that content, right? And the applicability of these tools depends on the quality. Now, the question is, if we just take AI out of the picture and we just talk about retrieval, what is it that makes search work? If we have clarity of language, if we have a clear scope, if we have structured or native digital content, if we have content that is current, we have clear versioning. These are the things that allow us to retrieve it just with basic search, right? And when these are applied to AI retrieval, it retrieves it based on the same principles, essentially. Because if it's good content and it's clear and it's curated and you don't have a lot of junk, and usually something like HR policy is reasonably well curated, right? You need to keep your policies up to date. There's some discipline to that. There's an organization that's responsible for that. They don't leave all sorts of random policies out there. Again, we need to make sure we understand the use case. If there are jurisdictional or regional variations, those need to be identified. but it all has to be in the content, and the content has to be able to be retrievable in the first place. So that is where we start to see this content working well. It works well as it would with general search, right? If full text would have worked, AI retrieval will work. And the question is, what makes a good search work? And those are the elements we talked about. So when we think about this, the HR and say PTO demo it has a lot of clean content, right? The language is clear. We have control vocabularies. We don't have a lot of synonyms. We have plain language, right? It's self-contained. We many times it does have a certain single jurisdiction, or it's marked. It's a narrow domain. It's stable content. Many times it will have consistent headings. We're not trapping meaning in images. It's all explicit, right? We have clear versioning. We have the things that allow us to do this, and the stakes are not as high in certain situations. There is human in the loop, right? There's less regulatory. You could say the HR policies do have regulatory exposure. That's not a blanket statement, but there's less regulatory exposure as in a policy about, say, loan operations or reporting or things like that, right? And it's easy to verify. It's not costly to verify. So the trap is not the demo. The trap is the generalization from the demo. Because when we use good content and it works, we try to say it's going to work with all content, and that is not the case, right? So when we think about this is a diagnostic. Where it works, it's telling you that your content is well structured, it's curated, it's well written, it's engineered, right? It has all those characteristics. Where it fails, it's telling you where the content is not ready, right? So that's where people start to realize when we get into very nuanced content, when we get into content about support, when we get into content about versions or model numbers or error codes or things that are very precise or specific regulatory requirements, right? Specific kinds of documents that really need to be finely understood and nuanced. That's when it doesn't work. That's when it's telling you this. So the right way to use these is a stress test, right? Test your content. It's a test. It's not a substitute for the content structure. It's a test of the content structure. So let's start with our first poll. Where in your organization have you tested AI in a corpus, gotten a good result, and assumed it generalizes, right? And you should be able to select all that apply. So HR policy, knowledge, product to technical documentation, regulated or safety critical, or you haven't tested yet, or you haven't gotten a good result, right? So where has it gotten a good result and then made the assumption that it generalizes? Okay, so people are getting it across these areas, product and technical documentation. Again, it all depends on the use case. And then the question is, some have not gotten a good result. Oh no, let's see. Oh, that's not, we don't have anybody saying that. Oh yeah, we do have one. Okay, there we go. It was hidden by my scroll. There we go. So some people haven't gotten a good result. Many haven't formally tested, but it looks like when there is certain things, and again, when you think about an internal knowledge base or a wiki, it really does depend on the use case, right? And then you have to exhaustively check those use cases and exhaustively test that content. Again, and then the question becomes, does it generalize? So I would venture to say this is more about the quality of those content sources, and that without a good quality content source, we will not have that. So let's go ahead and share those results. Oops, sorry, share results. I stepped on Carolyn's toes on that. So again, you can get a sense of people not testing, or they have done it in certain areas. And it looks like product document and internal knowledge. So that's good. It's interesting that they've gotten that. And the question becomes, how exhaustively have you tested that? And then how extensible are those results? Okay, let's keep going here. Heather, why don't you talk about what you have seen?
Yeah, so let's start with what we actually find when we walk into a content environment, right? The intent might be that SOPs are in SharePoint, policies are in our GRC portal, technical documentation is in the R&D wiki or the docs library, and that's the story, right? But the reality is messier. So content is scattered across systems, structure varies by author and by whatever tool was popular when we wrote it. Old versions accumulate. The 2017 version is still right there, sitting next to the latest version. looking just as authoritative.
Mm.
And that's what content looks like at scale. It's accumulation. And the problem is that AI doesn't know the difference.
So when we talk about the failure condition, again, a lot of it is content sprawl, right? Because we do have a lot of legacy repositories. We do have different tools. There's email attachments. There's personal organizing principles on a OneDrive or a Google Drive. And it's very difficult to do that in a scattered environment. When we stay with one particular database, one particular knowledge base, it's a little bit easier, but content lives in multiple places. So it's a little bit harder sometimes to get that right information. What we've been doing is we've been using projects and uploading content to specific projects to make sure that in Claude projects and ChatGPT projects to make sure that we're limiting the scope, that we have the right context for that. But again, there's structure and formatting consistency, right? Like documents that don't have a consistent headings or consistent structure, they've been written more freeform. They don't necessarily have metadata. Have this stuff locked in PDFs. When you try to crack them or break them and componentize them or bring them into a vector space, end up having a lot of document debris, right? Diagrams many times have meaning that's not extractable, right? And many times we have poor OCR of documents. So all these require some structure to interpret the meaning. And of course, version conflicts, as Heather was mentioning. What is the latest and greatest? And do we have versioning? We have things. I love when people use the term final in a document, file name, right? They say final, and then there's final, and then there's final, right? I say don't use final. Just use a date and a version, right? And then a lot of times we're not retiring content, right? So the system will retrieve the wrong answer. And these are different problems. They have different fixes, but we're going to talk about how to do that.
Yeah, so as a human, I can easily work around these failure conditions. When I walk through the content environment, I see a document library, organized folders, familiar file names. I know which document is the current one because I remember that meeting where Seth said the new version was approved, and I can navigate around the outdated content instinctively. But the AI doesn't have that knowledge. And so, Seth, what does the AI see?
It sees everything. It sees all the versions. It doesn't necessarily have that knowledge intuitive. It sees all the fragments. It sees conflicting terms. It doesn't necessarily rank according to your situation. The knowledge, the implicit knowledge isn't in the content. The knowledge about the content is not in the content. So that's what we have to do. We have to put that knowledge of the content in the content so that we have the ability to rank and provide the relevant information in the right context. So that's where we have a difference in terms of how humans might judge something and how machines might judge something. And so when AI sees things we can't see or we don't observe, we don't understand, how do we actually measure that? And this is where we have a framework. And Heather, talk a little bit about the framework.
So you can't prioritize what you haven't compared, and you don't want to say, let's improve our content without a measurement that could turn into a budget conversation with no priorities. So a useful framework has 4 properties. And if you're evaluating an approach, whether it's ours or somebody else's, these are the 4 things to check for. It has to be multidimensional. You can't roll them all into one score. They need to be measured separately so you know what to fix. And it has to be weighted. Some dimensions are going to matter more than others, and equal rates produce flat scores. So every document then would look the same and nothing rises to the top, and that's the opposite of useful. It has to be content type aware. A knowledge-based article isn't a white paper, isn't an SOP. One scoring profile doesn't fit all of those, and so pretending it does produces some noise. And it has to be corpus aware. So you're not just labeling individual documents, you're looking for patterns across the whole environment, patterns that admit a single fix. And so without these properties, you have scores, but you don't have a roadmap. And so that's the next step. So this is the framework we use, and Seth already mentioned it. We call it the AIR 10, rolls right off the tongue. Right?
10. It's the R10. Yeah.
AI retrieval readiness in 10 dimensions. So I'm not going to read all 10. The deck has them, and you can come back to that if you're wanting to see them all. What matters here is the structure. There are 10 weighted dimensions, and each one captures a different property of content that affects whether AI can retrieve it accurately. They're not all equal. 2 of them carry 15% each because they have the most direct impact on retrieval. So you can see the heavy hitters there are structural hierarchy and chunking and question answer alignment. Each dimension gets a defined weight. None of it is subjective.
I'm sorry,
Go
did I
back
go?
one.
Okay,
Go
sorry.
back one, Seth.
Yeah, sorry.
This is all important, I promise. So documents get scored against all 10, and then scores roll up into bands, which is what we see on the right side of the score, right? So excellent is at the top. It's optimized for AI retrieval. Critical is at the bottom. It's essentially invisible to AI systems. So most enterprise content is going to land in the moderate to the weak area, which is exactly where AI confidently returns the wrong answer. So let me give you a sense of what these scores mean. A document in the excellent band, so that would be 9 or above, it has clean headings, current dates, a defined audience, cited sources, named entities, and a structure that maps to how people ask questions. So AI is able to retrieve it accurately with the right context almost every time. And a document in the critical band, where that score is under 3, might be a 50-page PDF document with no headings or metadata, and the only clue about it is the file name, maybe. And so it might pull something relevant, but it might not be quite right. And most enterprise content sits somewhere in between. Confidently retrievable, confidently wrong when it is. This framework is also built into our VIA platform, and that means scoring runs across a whole corpus. And that matters because the patterns are what you actually remediate, and we'll get there in a minute. Now I'm done. All right, so scoring by themselves aren't a plan. You need to know which gaps to fix first, and that's what tiering does. So the 10 dimensions roll up into 3 tiers based on impact, right? So tier 1 is foundational. There's 3 dimensions that live there, and it's about clarity, structural hierarchy, and entity relationships. And without these, retrieval just doesn't work. You have to fix these or fence the content off or somehow isolate it from your AI. There's really not a third option. Tier 2 is optimization. So it's the verifiability, the currency, the metadata richness. Deficiencies here can cause the AI to surface content that's outdated or unverifiable. The retrieval still works. It just might not be grabbing the latest version. And the tier 3 is a refiner. So the difference here is that the content is technically correct, but it might not be pulling from a source or the source that is most trusted by that user, right? So it's more personalized. Most organizations want to start on tier 3 because the gaps are more obvious, right? They see, oh, our content isn't engaging. But actually starting at tier 1, the retrieval has to work before refinement even matters. Ready to move on. Okay, so let me show you what this looks like in 2 industries. First, insurance. The use case is an AI assistant. Oh, sorry, we're not in insurance first. We're in manufacturing. Okay, the first is an AI assistant for field technicians, and they are working with 2 different instruments, and they get the instructions back for the wrong one, right? What the AIRR10 returns is that it tells you that the variant scope isn't listed anywhere in the body context, that there's no section level applicability tagging, or even the model number is missing from the body text. So when it gets chunked, there's no information to help it understand when is it the X2500 versus the X2501. So the fix there is to bring in variant metadata, and that is something that can be engineered. If that is known somewhere in the document, it can be tagged throughout all of the chunks that the AI breaks up into. In the insurance case, you have an AI assistant used by underwriters and CSRs, and the wrong region is getting returned to staff. And that's because the jurisdiction isn't stated in the body, right? So the fix there is to identify the jurisdiction and make sure that gets injected into each chunk of content that is in the AI system, so that it is actually retrieving the right one. Because sometimes content is so similar, it could be right next to each other in the vector, and they can't tell the difference between the 2 jurisdictions. So the fix is the same. It's variant metadata, section level applicability, normalized terminology. It's the same failure mode. And AI doesn't know which scope the answer applied to. So here's two more examples, a different pattern. Life sciences, this is a RAG system for QA, and the content is SOPs written in a narrative form, right? So paragraphs, not steps. The failure mode is that systems retrieve steps out of order and some no longer comply with the current regulatory requirements. So what the AIRR10 surfaces is that the narrative prose is resisting this clean chunking. AI can't tell which sentences are steps, which are notes, which are exceptions. The versions coexist. Regulatory references are implied but not cited. So the fix is decomposition, breaking that narrative into steps with separate notes and exceptions, adding the regulatory metadata and enforcing version control. In the financial services, is a very similar use case. The content is inconsistent for definitions across the department of high risk customer. That phrase means one thing in compliance, something else in underwriting, and a third thing in fraud. So different concepts here, and there's no single network of meaning that AI can resolve to. So the fix is a controlled vocabulary or ontology alignment, reworking conflicting definitions, and definitely using applicability statements so that the AI knows the difference.
So the question here is, how do you learn to identify what the failure is and what the fix is? And we're giving you some examples, but this is where analyzing the content, it comes from doing the content audit, the content inventory or content audit, and sampling that content and then looking at the characteristics of that content. So it really, and that's where, again, a rubric or a framework like the one we use is valuable because it'll give you consistent, objective metric around what is missing in your content. But again, I think it's a matter of identifying the use cases, testing those use cases, doing an intervention, and then testing again. That's how you know you're on track. Yes, the rubric is the AIRR10, but you can look for other, if you don't want to use ours, you can look for others out there to say, how do I evaluate my content for retrieval, for AI retrieval? And again, you're going to see different things around generative engine optimization. It also does include some search engine optimization, traditional SEO principles, writing for an audience, clarity, semantic relevance, all these other things. It's that and more, right? Let's see. So looking for specific questions to ask and what the results of those questions point to. So we'll talk about that. Again, what we're saying here is you have to really evaluate the content, and we also have a readiness diagnostic that asks certain of those questions. We can take that offline to get into more detail around that if you'd like. We'll try to cover as much of that as we can here. Heather, did you want to add anything to that in terms of what you need to look for? And yeah, so okay, we can continue. By the way, I put this little thumbnail of the dimensions because you see down here it says D7, D5, D8, D6, D9, whatever. Those are these dimensions numbered here. D7 is the temporal context, the currency, how if there's no publishing date, etc. D5 is factual verifiability and clarity density, right? These are all the things you want to ask. So you could just ask these questions using these dimensions. Again, Heather, do you want to continue?
Yeah, so when you're reading a single document, you can look for all of these things, right? But when you have 10,000 documents, you can't read them all and look for all of these things. At 100,000, you can't even really sample by hand. So you sample intelligently and you score the sample and look for what repeats. And that's what we have here so that you can remediate the patterns and not the documents. Let's see what this looks like in practice. So the table at the bottom, this is a real cross-document analysis that we did with the AIRR10. And just to look at a couple of these here. So this first pattern is the currency signals are absent in the body text, meaning there are no published dates. There's no last reviewed dates. We don't know when this is written. We don't know if it's current. And so the AIRR10 tells us, hey, I have some remediation ideas for you. Set an editorial gate that for future content, you need to have this before it gets published, right? So looking future forward. And then it also said, go back and look at your high value content and make sure that's marked as current, right? So not boiling the ocean, but taking a very practical approach of solving this moving forward and dealing with the ones that you need to really deal with that bring the highest value to your business. In pattern 2, this is a thought leadership piece. and it doesn't have any external evidence. And so here, the remediation suggested is to have a minimum citation policy. So it's not saying to go back and remediate the ones you have, although certainly you could do that, but it's saying looking forward, you definitely want to set a minimum citation policy if that's important for GEO. And then I wanted to look at one more, which is the one that has two patterns or two dimensions, which is pattern 4. It says a strong entity tagging, weak concept linking. So what this is saying is that the entities are labeled, but the relationship between them are left implicit. And what it tells us in the remediation is it's suggesting, hey, if you add a related to or often co-occurs with, or if you include 2 to 3 sentences per piece to support the relationship, then that's enough to build or to support a graph buildable structure. Alternatively, you could apply a knowledge graph on the back end to support those relationships. So these are 5 different patterns and 5 different remediation fixes applied across the corpus. And when you do that, those 5 fixes lift hundreds of documents at once. And that's what corpus level measurement makes possible. You want to sample intelligently, score systematically, and remediate by the pattern.
Yeah, and hundreds of documents, thousands of documents, tens of thousands of documents, whatever fits that pattern. And that's why it's so valuable to do it this way, because it does give you that scale and that programmatic remediation.
Let's look at the types of remediation. So you have a structural remediation, which means reorganizing what's already there. That might be breaking a 40-page PDF into clean sections, adding headings, establishing chunking patterns. That's IA and knowledge engineering work. Editorial work means writing what was never written. So putting definitions in, audience statements, currency lines, that's a writer's job. And then there's information dependent work. That's capturing what's only in someone's head. Exact specifications, the reasoning behind a policy that lives only in the mind of an SME, or maybe even the relationship between products and frameworks that everyone might understand, but no one wrote down. So this is the slowest and hardest work, but arguably the most valuable. And now let's take a look at the rows. So here you can see that we're actually putting it against the tiers that we talked about earlier. So remember, tier 1 is that retrieval fails without these things, right? It can't understand these. And then in tier 2, retrieval, it works, but it might potentially, very likely could return the wrong variant information. And then the third one is that it's not from a trusted source, meaning it's not personalized in a way that can pick up on the user signals. So here's the part that matters for planning purposes. And if you could go forward one, Seth. As you move from structural to editorial to information dependent, the cost per item is going to rise. So structural work scales. You can run it in batches, right? Editorial work scales moderately. Information dependent work doesn't really scale at all. It's bottlenecked by SME availability. But the good news is the volume drops in the same direction. So most content needs structural work, less needs editorial, hopefully, and even less than that, hopefully, if you've triaged well, needs SME intervention. So with this curve in mind, tier can tell you the impact on the entire corpus, and then remediation can indicate the kind of cost or the level of cost you're looking at.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that was it. That was all I have to say on.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And again, what you're trying to do is think about the way you can easily remediate and what's going to be more costly. And so again, doing this kind of evaluation of your entire corpus gives you a sense of what that's going to entail. It looks like we have a couple questions here. Nope. Okay, so those are all responded to. Okay, so let's continue. Do you use a structured framework, or do you just use, so here's a poll. Do you use measurement to triage and prioritize content, or do you use neither? So are you using a structured framework? Do you measure and triage, or are you doing neither one? So a couple are saying neither. Okay, lots of opportunity to do this. That's pretty much a couple of folks are doing it. That's great. Several are not. I will just give you another minute or so for the poll. You should have enough time to answer other questions or give you a couple minutes back to your day. but looks like the popcorn has stopped popping. So let me, at last moment, I'll give you another chance to, okay, we ended it. All right. Share results. Okay, there we go. So most have not done this, either one. Some are using a structure framework, which is great. And then the question becomes, can you triage based on that? So that's what you need. You need to do both. Terrific. Okay, thank you for that. And let's continue on. So go ahead, Heather, talk a little bit about measurement versus content operations.
So measurement gives you a snapshot, right? It tells you the state of your content on any given day. And content operations is what keeps content retrievable over time. So it's the system that produces, maintains, and retires content with AI in mind. And you need both, right? And this is just what we were talking about. Measurement without operations is a one-time report. And operations without measurement is hoping, unfortunately. So we're going to look at how these pieces fit together and walk through content operations and how it affects things. So if we could go to the next slide, Seth. Okay, so there's three pieces here. The AIRR10 is the instrument. It measures whether content operations is actually working. And then the content readiness is the state. It's what AI retrieves from on any given day. And content operations is the function. So that's the process that produces and maintains the state. So we measure today, we see where we are, we act on what we see, and we remeasure. So the instrument is the entry point and the close the loop step. And the takeaway here is that content readiness isn't a milestone. You don't reach it. It's a state you have to maintain. There's a rhythm to it.
That's a great observation. So again, you're continuing this process through content operations. You're measuring, you're remediating, you're measuring again. So I like the way you're thinking of this. It's a state. It's not a milestone. It's a state, and that has to be continually. We're reversing entropy, right? Entropy, it comes into any system. Everything goes from order to disorder, and it takes energy to reverse entropy. So you have entropy infiltrating every system and process that you have. Just like your room and your office get messy, your kitchen gets messy, and you have to put energy into creating order from disorder. This is what we're doing. We're doing it in a methodological way that allows you to do it efficiently, cost effectively, and in a way that measures business value. Okay, let's talk about the content lifecycle.
Yeah, we have to think about this at both the document level and the corpus level, right? So when we go deeper here, this is at the per document discipline. So for each stage of the content lifecycle, three things have to be defined. Ownership is the easy part. Who owns the content at that stage? Criteria is what looks good at that stage, and the triggers are when the next stage activates. So if we look at how this plays out across a few of these stages, at approval, the owner is typically I'm sorry, I lost my spot here. Let's see. Oh, at review, typically the owner is still the author, right? Waiting to have back the comments. And so you might have human reviewers like the SMEs, or you might have tooled or automated ones like the AIR10, right? And so when those pass, then that's the trigger to get moved to approval and then ultimately to publishing. And then I wanted to comment on retirement, because retirement closes the loop on the version conflicts from the failures we saw, the failure items we saw earlier. And without it, superseded content keeps feeding the RAG system. And that's where you can get that failure point again.
So again, you need these triggers, right? Because the triggers are causing something to happen. It's like when people say, when are you done with taxonomy? Or when are you done with content management or knowledge management? It's when you're done with sales. When are you done with manufacturing? When are you done with customer service? It's an ongoing process. And so these triggers will cause you to remediate and review, and just to make sure that you don't have content drift. Model drift is another thing, and we're going to talk about, and we can measure that as well. But again, these are the things that are causing us to make changes or to monitor changes, and then we need to measure and improve. Heather, do you want to make a comment on this one?
Yeah, so to do any of this lifecycle operations governance, you need to know what you have and not what you think you have, but what you actually have. And you cannot govern what you cannot see. So the content audit is how you get to that picture. And so let's talk about the audit loop next. So the audit is not a one-time event. It's a loop, and this is how we handle the corpus level health, right? It's the discipline for keeping our content AI ready, the whole corpus. So the inventory is like what's in scope, what do you actually have, and where does it live? And this inventory addresses our content sprawl directly that we had as a failure point earlier. You can't measure what you can't find, right? So it has to be on the inventory. Then you score with whatever framework you have, and you don't have to score every document. You're looking for the shape of the corpus, right? You want to identify patterns, corpus level signatures, and this is where your measurement turns into a plan. Then you triage and have disposition. You want to do what matters most. Not every gap is worth fixing. You remediate, apply the corrections that match the patterns, you instrument and monitor, and you track performance over time, watch for drift, then rescore. And note that there are intersection points between the audit loop and the content lifecycle. So the audit loop is critical to the review and monitor stages in the lifecycle. They both rely heavily on those gates to pass. I don't know if you had any more to say on, Seth, on the intersection between those
so
two.
Again, what you're looking at under the content lifecycle is where you need to do that review and measurement and monitoring. And that's where the audit loop comes in, right? We're looking for those things that need to be changed. So it's another set of processes that allow you to measure what's working, measure what's not working, look at the business impact, look at audience usage, looking at the patterns, and again, being able to do that remediation at that programmatic level.
Okay, triage is where the budget gets decided. So here's a matrix to help you with that decision-making process. There are two axes here. One is your measurement, right? For us, it's the AIRR 10 score. And the other is the business value, right? So we have 4 quadrants. You have a high score, high value, and that's great. Keep and monitor that. The content's working, don't touch it. Just make sure it stays that way, right? If you have a high score and low value, that's fine. You can keep it, move on. If you have a low score, low value, let's retire it. This is content that's both poor quality and not worth fixing. The honest answer is to remove it from the corpus. AI doesn't need it. You don't need it, right? If you have a low score, high value, this is the only quadrant that gets engineered. This is where session 4's knowledge engineering process applies. Engineer last, engineer least. So let's make this concrete. If you have a 5-year-old white paper, it has a low score, maybe no current dates, maybe the examples are a little outdated because it was before generative AI was a big deal, or it has a weak structure, but the business still talks about it constantly, right? Engineer it. If nobody references it anymore, retire it. That's completely different decisions depending on the business value, right? And that reason that the bottom right quadrant is so important is that engineering is the most expensive remediation aside from the SME work. And you only want to do it where the business value justifies the cost. And this is what we're saying. We are asked a lot, how do I know what content needs to have IA? And this is the answer, right? It's your low scoring content, but it's high value to the business. This is the content that needs IA. And the next slide has
Again,
a little bit
I
of
like engineer last, engineer least. So again, it's the stuff that's critical, right? Yeah.
And I was actually going to go right there and say this is a different view of that, right? It's a sideways funnel. And if you take 100% of your audited content and you're dropping it off in 4 buckets as you slim it down, you want to retire what you can first. You want to remove what's wrong everywhere. That's free, right? You want to keep what's working. That's also free. You want to fence off or isolate what's right, but maybe not appropriate for a particular corpus or use case. It's an underused option. So the content might still be right, but you don't want to delete it, right? You just want to keep it out of the AI's retrieval path when it doesn't apply. So a quick example might be a regional underwriting guideline that's accurate for the West Coast, but wrong for the Northeast. Doesn't need to be deleted or rewritten. It just needs to be fenced off from the Northeast use case, right? Tag it, constrain retrieval. That document is back to being useful for the right people. And then that last bucket is engineer. So you want to scope, score, remediate. Has a little bit higher cost. This is the bucket you want to be small. The triage's success metric is how few documents end up in that engineer bucket. I know that sounds counterintuitive. Isn't engineering the whole point? But it isn't. Most of the enterprise AI work is filtering and fencing and not engineering. So the deeper you audit, the less engineering, hopefully, you actually need.
Yep. So I think, again, you want to make those haystacks smaller. We're looking for needles in haystacks, smaller haystacks.
Exactly.
So we have content drift, right? This is when the world changes and your content does not, right? When this is the trigger framework we talked about. And we need to make sure that we are reviewing things on a regular basis and that we have this review cadence that looks at the change of that, the pace of change, the velocity of change in that repository, right? Or that content type. We also have model drift, and this is where it's quieter and it's more difficult to monitor. The example I use is I was creating some documents and I have very particular formatting standards. And those are in the rules for the project. Those are in project knowledge, and I reinforced them quite a bit. And then I started noticing that these reports were being created and they started subtly drifting from my format. And then after the third or fourth of these that came through, they were drifting farther and farther from my formatting guidelines. And I started noticing it wasn't using the right file naming convention. It wasn't versioning. So I said, you didn't format this according to our standards. Why is that? And it said, yeah, I skipped it. I was like, you skipped it? Like, why did you skip it? And it said, I got absorbed in the problem. I got absorbed in the problem. And it's almost like if Heather created this great document for me and I picked on her and said, Heather, you didn't format it. She'd be like, what, are you crazy? That was such a great deliverable. What do you care about the formatting? It was part of the standard, right? And it shouldn't. And the model was saying, hey, I got absorbed in solving this really complex problem. And I thought of formatting as downstream. And I said, so are you telling, but it was in your instructions. It was a rule. Are you telling me that I can still write instructions, make it a rule, and you still may not follow those instructions? And it said, yes, it may not follow the instructions. Why? Because it becomes statistically less relevant. When I have these long problems and prompts and lots of documents to process, it doesn't prioritize the formatting. It doesn't prioritize that rule unless I put it in the instructions again, because again, it is less significant. It said, I don't have a name for my agent other than Claude, but it said, I thought of it as a downstream process and it's not, right? And even if it's downstream, fine, still do it, but it skipped it. That is silent drift. That is drift that you don't notice until it happens. So we have to be able to manage that. We have to be able to benchmark it. We have to constantly manage and monitor retrieval, and we have to compare across different models. We measure content drift with a framework like the AIRR10, but we measure retrieval and with another LLM or performance index. So here's one of the other modules that we have in, by the way, this is all built in something called VIA, the Virtual Information Architect. And it does a lot of stuff. It does the stuff we're talking about. It does other things. It monitors governance, manages risks, et cetera. But it also does the quality output, right? It has composite scores for, say, search retrieval, but it also measures answer relevance and has a judge scoring LLM. It looks at groundedness, which is saying, where are you getting that reference information? Are you being able to understand it? It looks at how is it comparing against the golden set of truth, right? How are we ranking the content in the results? How are we attributing it? Do we have citation accuracy? Are we hallucinating, right? How do we detect those fabricated facts? We have to use another model for that. We have to ask it very specific questions. Is it adhering to the scope and the boundaries of the content? Is it escalating appropriately when it needs to? How are we doing with user satisfaction? How are we doing with you? These are all things that are very important when it comes to model drift management and remediation. Certain things you have to do, but you have to monitor it. You can also monitor costs with this model. You can also monitor a lot of stuff. But anyway, that's the important thing about that. We say the model performs as well as the content it retrieves, right? So we need to invest in that capability, also invest in content readiness, because otherwise the foundation is not stable. And we found that companies that have been doing this for a long time, that have cared about knowledge and content curation, are way ahead of the game, way ahead of the game. We did a project for a company 10 years ago, create once, publish everywhere, using data, component authoring. That is exactly the model that needs to be applied today. And that's the model we talked about in my book. And it said one can use taxonomy ontology for both the model and the content drift. Yes, that is true. You want to be able to use those organizing principles in both cases, but you do need to measure different things. But yes, organizing principles, taxonomy, ontology, metadata are important in both circumstances. So again, content is not a downstream concern. It's really the primary determinant of reliable AI at scale. So where do we start? We start with a content type, not the whole corpus, right? We can evaluate a corpus, score it against whatever framework you trust, find the patterns, triage by value. The audit teaches you more than the next initiatives, right? The audit is really important, right? Build your own framework, use someone else's, use ours, doesn't matter, but you have to be able to measure that corpus. In our next session, we're going to be doing pilot to road to production. How do we look at where we are, sequence, build, and make this something that is very tractable, is very solvable? That's the question we're going to answer. In the first sessions 3, 4, and 5, we built the structure, we engineered the content. Now, how do we connect all those dots? That is the next session. So be sure to tune in for that. Now, here's what our offer is today. We will give you a complimentary evaluation up to three documents, which is up to 50-page maximum, right? Will you take more documents if they're shorter, Heather? Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, all right. But we want to do it with just a few documents, but we want to show you what this is. What you do is you get the fully weighted score, every dimension scored, the citation, the evidence, the retrieval, roadblocks, what are the gaps, any specific remediation actions, before and after illustrations. So give us 2 or 3 documents. Do we have a process for getting that on the website yet, Heather, or are we just going to have people email us?
We'll have to share out the URL. It's not up yet, but it will be shortly.
Okay, so send us a note if you want to do that, and we'll have a URL available for you to do this submission. But that's something that'll help you understand, at least get a sense of how that works. We also still have the AI Readiness Quick Check Diagnostic. This is a diagnostic. $2,500 for the first report, $1,000 for each additional ones. We recommend you get about 10 of them. You get different responses from different parts of the organization. This gives you a lot of information. This tells you whether it diagnoses where you are, and it has a remediation roadmap as part of it. So that's a very valuable. We have a conversation with us. Let's have a conversation, and we can talk about whether it makes sense to give you one to test it out and then see how it reflects in your organization and so on. But we're happy to have a conversation. So just reach out send a note to Seth@Earley.com. And then here is the report that we have published. You can get this at white papers, Earley.com white papers. This is the AI Readiness white paper. This is basically what we found when we measured across organizations. We'll send you this URL in a follow-up email, but this is what we found when we measured this across a number of different enterprises based on our research so far. So take a look at that. Really great observations there. And that's it for now. We will give you 1 minute back to your day. I don't think we have any other questions, but there's my email address. Send a note. Tell us if you'd like to talk about the AIRR, or tell us that you're interested. Tell us if you'd like to talk about the AI Readiness Diagnostic, right? And how valuable that is. People have equated that to about a $25,000 deliverable. And the reason we can do it so inexpensively is we've built it on top of our IP. We have a library of hundreds and hundreds of documents that, again, are the frameworks and the methodologies. We have 22 different frameworks, methodologies, the guidelines, the approaches, the past projects, the templates, all of those things. And that's how we build these assessment diagnostics. And they tell you where you are and what you have to do next. And they have further questions for additional exploration. So it's very valuable, and it's a great place to start. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Heather. Appreciate your time. Be sure to tune in for the next session. Again, that is going to be on June 3rd. So again, this is the URL. You'll get that as well. And you can listen to all the sessions. There should be a link to the full series there as well. So thanks, everyone, and we will see you next time.